A very good evening and a warm welcome. At Hyde Park tonight, we will talk about Sri Lanka's situation in a growing geopolitical situation where tensions arise with global powers eyeing on Sri Lanka, and also about Sri Lanka's way forward in terms of countering extremist elements, extremism, terrorism, and what steps Sri Lanka has taken going forward since the 21st of April this year. We've invited to our studios the Director General of the Institute of National Security Studies of Sri Lanka, Dr. Asanga Abeyagoonesekara. Good evening and a warm welcome.
Good evening.
You are extensively and actively engaged in advising government agencies and consulting with them on security issues, regional security, national security. And I'd like to start off with your book, the book that you authored, Sri Lanka at Crossroads, Geopolitical Challenges and National Interests. From 2015 onwards, you've spoken here. I'd like to highlight here something that former Foreign Secretary and National Security Advisor to the Prime Minister of India, Shiv Shankar Menon, had said about your book. Abeyagoonesekara has written a wide-ranging and frank set of essays setting out a Sri Lankan point of view on the country's geopolitical and internal political challenges and opportunities. It is a realistic portrayal of Sri Lanka's pivotal position of the intertwined relations with India and China and of the options for the future. What are our options for the future?
Well, if you, the book speaks about the geostrategic position of Sri Lanka and how important Sri Lanka is for the rest of the other countries, the emerging powers and the existing powers. There are triple spheres of influence I speak about in the book. The US sphere of influence, the Indian sphere of influence, and the Chinese sphere of influence. And how our policies have to be made, the foreign policy of this country, and also looking at the national interest of the country, and how we should design these policies. I speak specifically on India about the Kaveri Delta effect, the southern Indian peninsula, how it affects Sri Lankan, the northern area of Sri Lanka in a geopolitical context. And it's been happening from the history, and it will happen for the next 100 years.
Is this why you're saying that there is an existential threat from India and other powers in Sri Lanka? What other powers are you talking about? Is this specifically China and the United States?
I say it because of the geostrategic position of Sri Lanka. There is an existential threat to the country because of our position in the Indian Ocean. It's been happening if you look at, scan back 1,000 years, or if you take back what the history that we have gone through, there has been amazing challenges. Our leaders have faced many challenges, and because of our position, so the threat will remain, because the static variable of geography will not change. But how do we sort of take this the extra regional as well as extra regional pressures or the spheres of influence, and how do we weigh? I talk about, I look at it in a way, a person who's walking on a tightrope, and if you don't have a pole to balance, you will not have your balance. So the country is...
Is it that difficult for Sri Lanka?
It is difficult. It is very difficult. I think because of the interest of other countries. Mm-hmm. Now, if you look at the few weeks ago, I was in Singapore at the Sangri-La dialogue, and where Patrick Shanahan, the acting Defense Secretary, released the document on Indo-Pacific on June 1st. And in the 64-page document, there's 13 times he has referred to Sri Lanka. And the other South Asian countries are also there, but the first significant reference is to India in South Asia. The second reference is to Sri Lanka. The reason behind is the geostrategic location of Sri Lanka. And our leaders need to sort of absorb this and understand this and create a better future for our people. and that's really important.
You've continued to speak about the importance of Sri Lanka's geopolitical location in this region. But let's touch a little on the SOFA agreement and the AXA agreement. This has risen to be controversial topics in today's political circle. The SOFA agreement, the State of Forces agreement, again, United States, and the AXA agreement, acquisition and cross-services agreement. This was first signed in 2007 and renewed in 2017 under the present government. But what is this talk about US bases being set up in Sri Lanka and US military invading Sri Lanka, or the ability or the window made available through these agreements for foreign powers to come to Sri Lanka? Is this a truth or is this a myth?
Well, I think it's over-amplified in certain media outlets. But if you look at the AXA agreement, there are clear observations we have given as an Institute of National Security Studies. When we get a document of this nature, we scan through it and we look at, we do an analysis part. Where are the other countries which are signed, and what are the national security threats from this agreement? We have given our observations to AXA back then, back in 2017, and then, but I'm not sure whether those their observations were taken. Even for the SOFA agreement, we have given the present agreement, so those observations has to be taken.
What were these observations?
AXA, we mentioned clearly there should be a term limit. For example, they sign indefinitely, because you don't sign agreements indefinitely. So we saw that as a...
So this agreement Sri Lanka has entered into has indefinite,
indefinite
provisions.
Yeah. So that's AXA. And, but we have mentioned few other areas also. And for example, it should go to the Parliament, because these are logistics agreements. Now, when it's logistics, one of their flights would come, unload the stuff, load it, and then take it to the aircraft carrier, which country could benefit economically. But it doesn't mean that they can, for example, on the SOFA, they have a clause on the on telecommunications equipments that they can bring in, but then it has to go through the Telecommunication Regulatory Commission that we have. They cannot sort of, bypass the Regulatory Commission. So these things, these are few amendments that we have made our observations, and it has to be taken. It's not, there's no factors saying that the Americans are coming here to set up a base, or Chinese are coming here to colonize, or these are all, I think, over-amplified statements. Because now Diego Garcia is another, always there I see references in the media as well as that Americans are losing Diego Garcia, they're looking at Sri Lanka. I don't think so. Even if even the judgment has been given by the International Council, but then these sort of decisions are geopolitical decisions. For example, the American Fifth Fleet is now in near Hormuz, Strait of Hormuz, and they're protecting the oil tanker attacks, which is happening right now. They will not leave the region. You see, the American presence will be there, and also the Chinese presence, which is growing presence. It's very clearly visible in the region. So that doesn't mean they're coming to colonize us, or they're going to
So does this mean there is no threat to Sri Lanka given these agreements, especially with, I think, let me quote from Parliament also, they say if implemented, the agreement would take away Sri Lanka's right to inspect any US vessels, aircraft or naval vessels that enter Sri Lanka. Now, with these sort of documents circulating, how do we look at the security, the threat, the risk to Sri Lanka?
These are not highly classified documents. You see, number one, we should understand what are classified, what is highly classified. These are not, these are logistics agreements, which can go to the Parliament, it can be discussed, which other countries have done. So,
why haven't we taken this up in Parliament?
That's a good question. So we have mentioned, we have given our observations from the Institute of National Security Studies, take it to the Parliament, discuss, and then come into some terms. There's no problem of because none of them are highly classified in here. If you look at it, these are just logistics agreements. So if US has signed in many countries, Sri Lanka, if they want to sign, that's fine. But you have to see the future of it, because if you sign with such agreements with the United States, we have also made that observation, saying that don't be surprised if China also gives us an agreement like this in the future.
Mm-hmm. And something you mentioned earlier on was that the observations that you have made to government agencies, the government, Parliament, has not been taken up. What do you think happens to all these documents, the research that you do, all those hours of research that you put into, the work that is the outcome?
No, I think it's kind of disappointing when you look at it from the research kind of perspective, because if you look at the attack, the 421 attack, I was there at the Sangri-La when the attack was there, and I was walking with my family when the blast happened. I wrote the first article or the document. It's called the Monthly Threat Forecast. MTF was designed, our institute designed it, and it was MTF was for the president to see. Basically threats that the president should see every month, and what we do an environment scan on the region, the global, and we look at it. So 2017 March, we saw an extremist threat coming into the country, and we conducted a discussion at the Ministry of Defense on 30th March, and basically having the Chief of National Intelligence, SIS, everybody present.
This was 2017 March, last year, March, sorry, 2 years ago.
2 years ago, 2017, March 30th was the discussion with everyone. Mm-hmm. And the idea was basically, these are internal discussions, and we don't bring in external people from outside. So this discussion is recorded, and the record is there in the Ministry of Defense. In that, we connect somebody from Kathamkudi. We get his narratives, what's going on in there. We want to understand what's happening. Then what we do is we even come to, during halfway in the discussion, basically we speak about what if the extremists check into hotels and blow themselves up. What would happen? We go into that extent in that discussion. So this was in 2017 March, which we wrote I wrote the monthly threat forecast on that, based on the discussion, saying there is a significant threat to Sri Lanka from extremist group. Subsequently, on 2017 October, the second report goes to the president saying there is a significant threat because of the large number of recruits going from Maldives to the ISIS. And we see it as Sri Lanka could be used as a hub by these extremists, and this could creep into our society. And this is in 2017 October. And the last one was on 2019 January, when the detonators were found. Mm-hmm. And explosives in Vilpattu. So we saw it as a significant threat, and we again put it up, saying that there is a serious threat to national security. And it was very unfortunate, I mean, to see by myself, number one, as well as right in front of my eyes, and then all this unfolding. And all these documents were done, these recordings are there. And
where do you think these got misplaced, especially when you say you went into detail about discussing, about trying to understand the probabilities of possibilities of, you know, hotels being targeted? When you go into such detail, where do you think these got misplaced?
MTF is written by me, signed with a memo, basically a covering note. So it's basically compiling the document, then signed by me. It's addressed to the Secretary of Defense. And in that letter, it's clearly mentioned to brief to the President. So on the MTF cover note, the monthly threat forecast cover note, it says President only, for President's eyes only. So basically, it is going to Presidents. We thought it would go there.
So have you, since you're engaged in discussions and consultancies and advisories with the President, have you taken this up with the President? Has he seen these?
I did, but apparently the secretaries have not briefed, the 3 secretaries who was there, so they have not briefed the President on these issues. So this is what was mentioned, and also, and this is quite sad, because what we do is with a lot of work and a lot of analysis we do. And when we do it, when we write this, of course, you know, we think about because there is no place. I mean, soon after the attack, this is the reason I proposed an ITAC. And ITAC is an Integrated Threat Assessment Center. We don't have such a thing. So I said to establish it under the Chief of National Intelligence Office, CNI, so that we can weigh these threats and report it to the President and institutionalize it.
Right.
Basically, there will be somebody who's going to the President, sitting with the President, and speaking about it, and there will be a minute about it, that this briefing has happened with the President. In a country like United States, you have a daily briefing. It's called a PDB, President's Daily Brief. So looking at when the Institute was established, looking at all the threats that Sri Lanka has, so I came up with this idea that said, at least we should have an MTF, a monthly threat forecast. So
and Dr. Abeyagoonesekara, you were mentioning that the importance of institutionalizing your research work through ITAC. But let's talk a little about, let's go back to the Parliamentary Select Committee proceedings, where our intelligence chief, who resigned recently after testifying before the PSC, he mentioned your name. Your name was brought up where he said that he had asked you to compile observations and analysis on what's happening, especially pertaining to extremism and the work of extremists. And he said that there was no response from your side.
Well, I have to say that he's lying. I mean, he lied to the PSC, because his letter on the 23rd of March 2017, he sent me this letter, which he's referring to. And this is the letter that he's sent me. And this is the reply. On the 27th of March, I've sent the reply. So he basically on talking about the root causes of, he wants me to analyze and find out what are the root causes of extremism. So the reply is clearly mentioned. So he was an officer who has served for a long time, and so I think, I don't know why he mentioned that, but we have sent the reply.
You say the hosting of Threat Lens, assessing the threats of violent extremism in South Asia with a special focus on Sri Lanka, and the hosting of the consortium on South Asian think tanks. These were the areas that you preventing terrorism and countering violent extremism.
We focused on two areas. One was that 30th discussion which we had, and then the next one was a larger group which we got a lot of scholars in, and then entire region. Scholars from entire region, and taking their inputs on countering violent extremism. And so we got a view from Bangladesh, we got from India, various other scholars from Nepal. And so two reports have been compiled. One was the monthly threat forecast. The second one was the consortium of South Asian think tanks along with the INSS, what we did. And that report is available online. You can read that. So we have actually
in his letter to you by the former Chief of Intelligence, Sisira Mendis, there is a talk about Tawhid Jamaat in March of 2017. This is where it is mentioned that clashes within the moderate Islamic factions in the area and voiced in favor of ISIS ideology. And there was a request made to you to do research. But let's talk a little about your research now. How far is this threat now in Sri Lanka?
Well, it's as any country in the world, how Bangladesh has taken, how France has taken, Copenhagen has taken. I don't sort of, I mean, we look at it as one cell, but there could be more in the society, and because this extremism comes from an ideology, as you know, and it's coming from the Greek school of themos, the identity, the about yourself. Anyone can be radicalized. So that's the reason the educated are getting radicalized. And it's about an identity that they look for, and the young people, especially below 30. I go to, in my class at the university, I teach on the international security subject. I put up the the Bangladesh attackers, when I talk about the transnational threats, and I look at their, and I talk about their profiles. So you look at the profiles, one has gone to Monash, they are educated. What made them do this? So what are the theories that we can apply? So when you look at it, what we are fighting is a transnational threat, number one, and a threat for identity. So if Sri Lanka does not create a national identity now, there's a huge problem, because because I cannot take your identity, I cannot take anybody else's identity. Now, Francis Fukuyama's book, The Identity, if you read it, he has rightly put it. Basically, societies, we cannot take other people's identity, so let them have the identity, but we can create overarching identity on top of that. So that is the national identity. What the country needs to produce is basically national identity. Mm-hmm. Schools that produce children from national identity. So what we have, because you cannot have Buddhist schools, Christian schools, all this, so you have, and also bringing in, you know, when you create a nation with national identity, your threat to national security will be minimum.
Have you taken this up with the leadership of the country?
I haven't spoken on that regard on national, but I have written about national interest in my book.
And also, yes, about your book, I'd also like to talk about that. But before that, terrorism attack in Sri Lanka, countering violent extremism, post 21st of April. You speak about violent extremism here, also about a policy brief where you talk about several recommendations going forward for the country. Now this document looks at social recommendations, economic recommendations, educational. I think that's where you talk about how education, but governmental recommendations, what specifically do you think we have to do as a to set up a mechanism, especially when it is highlighted that either these analysis or recommendation that our think tank puts so much of effort into does not go to the leadership, or whether there is no deliberation about intelligence information. Where do we go from here?
Well, if you look at this was a post-attack, we did this on the 16th. After the new secretary took office, and we're very happy that he's given approval on this, as well as he chaired it coming in, and we're very actually happy to sort of see that, because the engagement is what we need from the leadership. And so basically this is a compilation of all the what we have gathered on that discussion, and also we did an analysis on what needs to be done as a country, and what the government should do, what the society should do. And few recommendations, if I brief you on the acts, what we need. I mean, we need a sedition act. Do we need a sedition act in this country? I think we need a sedition act. Do we need a religious harmony act, just like in Singapore? Of course we need to, because if you look at it, the narratives that we see in the media as well as in social media, there are you know, hate speech as well as many other speech being sort of projected in social media. So in a country like this, how do we create a national identity with these narratives? We cannot. So we need an harmony act, a religious harmony act, and also a fake news, and these sort of things. These acts have to come from the parliament. Now, if you look at the New Zealand example, she did it within the Prime Minister, who was a 38-year-old lady. I mean, amazingly, she did it in few days, I mean, few weeks, I would say. And she even mentioned, I remember saying that, you know, Australia takes 3 months, and I have done it, you know, in few weeks' time. And she passed certain legislation and acts. So acts have to be done from the government side to make sure that the society will focus on basically creating a national identity rather than, you know, having individuals to create their own political or religious identity groups.
Very quickly, you also are a part of the National Security Council advisory meetings, which meets on a monthly basis and also very frequently. This is shortly after the attacks that you were asked to be a part, invited to be a part of it. Tell us a little about what happens here. What kind of advising do you do here?
His Excellency, the President, Maithripala Sirisena, he's the one who created this, the advisory body, which is a very good idea to create a larger body and to advise the National Security Council. So he rightly identified that many voices have to be heard. So there is former President Rajapaksa, then there is opposition leader, and also the Prime Minister, Sambandhan, Honorable Sambandhan. So all of them are part of this, so that we hear different voices from many stakeholders, and they actually spoke about their grievances, the issues, what needs to be done. And so we take note of these comments and all that. So the first meeting was held last month, and so we are supposed to meet once a month and discuss on. So it's a good forum, I mean, to talk about national security. I mean, as a country that we have, if you have a significant threat from outside as well as now internal also, so let us meet and discuss. So it was a really good meeting, I would say,
right.
A very positive meeting.
I think on that note, that's all we have at Hyde Park. Thank you very much for joining us. We had with us Dr. Asanga Abeyagoonesekara, author of the book Sri Lanka at Crossroads, and also Director General of the Institute of National Security Studies of Sri Lanka. Thank you for joining us at Hyde Park.